Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. China's newest Coast Guard vessel is a converted destroyer warship, and it's destined for deployment in the East and South China Seas, according to Chinese reports. According to American think tank the CSIS, the US's 73 Navy destroyers, bristling with missiles, guns and radars, allow the American military to exert control and project power across the seas. So, what does this mean for Beijing's so-called Second Navy? And can the increasing aggressive behaviour from China's Coast Guard law enforcement officers remain below the level of war? Joining us today are Tony Hu, former US Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, Liu Fu-kuo, National Chengchi University Institute of International Relations Research Fellow, and Ronan Fu, Academia Sinica Institute of Political Science Assistant Research Fellow. Very warm welcome to you all on the show today. The role of China's Coast Guard was supplemented 3 years ago with the introduction of China's 2021 Coast Guard law. Let's take a look at Articles 22 and 83. In cases of illegal infringement on sovereignty committed by foreign organisations or individuals in the seas, all necessary measures, including the use of weapons, may be taken. Article 83, the CCG should execute missions, including defence operations based on relevant laws, such as the National Defence Law and the People's Armed Police Law, and orders from the Central Military Commission. Tony, if I can start with you. So how does this differ from before and from how you understand that the US Coast Guard operates?
Well, the US Coast Guard has primarily a peacetime mission. So they do maritime law enforcement, such as prevention of illegal fishing. They do maritime response to accidents, search and rescue. And they also do maritime safety. They make sure the ships are suitable for sailing and have the right equipment. They do have a minor defense role where, in case of war, they do mainly a surveillance, reconnaissance type mission for defense. It's quite different from the Chinese Coast Guard because Chinese Coast Guard is a major tool for their gray zone tactics. They basically act as the commanding ship for their maritime militia. So obviously, maritime militia is actually called People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. So they serve a sort of semi-military mission, and these are not true fishing fleets. So basically, Chinese Coast Guard is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They have a much more military offensive role than the traditional coast guards of other countries.
Yeah, and do we see that in this 2021 law? I mean, would there be the inclusion of the use of weapons, for example, for the US Coast Guard?
Well, US Coast Guard is authorized to use weapons when the illegal activity or the intruder, such as a drug smuggler, starts to resist and use arms. So mainly it's to use to enforce law in more of a defensive action.
Yeah, and because here it says illegal infringement on sovereignty.
Right. So in China's role, I think they actually authorized the Coast Guards to use weapons as one of the means to sort of enforce the sovereignty. And that could be anything, just like in South China Sea. So it takes on a more offensive meaning versus self-protection or defensive.
Right. And so, Ronan, if we can, discuss any of the recent Coast Guard incidents that reflect this role of, as we said, it's essentially to protect sovereignty or basically prosecute territorial claims on Beijing's behalf.
Yeah, so ever since the 2021, the enactment of the 2021 Coast Guard law, basically we see a significant upstick in patrols within disputed waters. So that's number one. Number two, they actually are invited to a couple of military exercises. Right, so usually there's a fine line between military forces and civilian users.
And Professor Liu, for example, we had the quite shocking incident recently where the Chinese Coast Guard actually attacked a Philippine Navy sort of rigid hull boat using an axe and knives. Do you think, does this very much in line with what we can see there for the 2021 Coast Guard law?
Basically, as I see this Coast Guard new law connecting with a very fundamental and key word, as you mentioned, sovereignty. So from Chinese perspective, if anything, penetrating or violating the sovereignty of PRC, they will conduct such a law enforcement utilizing any possible means. So the particular thing is including use weapons. But I think for many countries in the world, in this similar law, they will put up necessary measures. But normally they will not indicating use weapons or things. But this is something specific, different from other countries. But as you mentioned, back in August, Chinese Coast Guard was ramming the Philippines public ships, and there was insistence from their side. This is infringing their sovereignty. But of course, the problem is the Philippines and PRC are looking into the same thing, claiming they have sovereignty. So it is very difficult to say.
Ronan, Professor Liu mentioned that China uses, China obviously comes from its own perspective in terms of the sovereignty issue. It claims the waters under the 9 or 10- line. Now, recently at the ASEAN summit, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Philippine president, he talked about China's aggression in Manila's exclusive economic zone. And China's response to that, Beijing's response to that, was to say that China settles maritime differences through dialogue. And it was Mao Ning who said, quote, based on historical facts and international law. Do you, in your view, does China actually follow international law, or does it follow its own law? This is the Coast Guard law, which follows the national defense law.
Yeah, I think that China's actions and laws basically, contradict to its diplomatic assertions of resolving the dispute through dialogue and adherence to the international law. And I believe it reflects a somewhat deliberative, double-hand strategy. So on the one hand, they want to make sure that they can maintain a somewhat favorable international image in front of the international community. We're trying to adhere to the international law.
Now, CSIS says that destroyers serve as the backbone of any modern navy due to their multi-mission capabilities, speed, and cruising range. Take a look at this satellite image printed by Voice of America in June 2024. It shows China's reconstruction of a Type 052D destroyer at the Jiangnan shipyard in Shanghai. Local media reported that the ship has already been painted with Coast Guard signs and colors. Professor Liu, let me come to you. According to the Japanese government, the Chinese Coast Guard has previously received frigates, and in fact, I think 20 of the Coast Guard vessels are former frigates, but even destroyers in the past. So what do you think is special about this 052 destroyer?
Basically, this is a tradition. Before this year, Chinese government did not really specifically design Coast Guard ship. Mostly in the past, they just inherit from the Navy. When the Navy decided to retire, decommission some destroyer frigate, then they would just move to Coast Guard to renovate and then to build into the law enforcement missions. But since the beginning of this year, there is a new model. They are lacking this comprehensive ship, which is in between 6,000 to 1,000 ton, 10,000 ton. So this 052 is about 7,000 ton, which is exactly Chinese current Coast Guard does not have. So this is something new, building into the strengths into the existing picture. So I consider if we are thinking what specific feature Chinese Coast Guard has, it is expanding into this particular field, 7,000 tons.
So your argument is that it's about the size or the displacement as opposed to the technical features of it. Let's go into the technical features with Tony. What modifications are being made to the destroyer, the 052 destroyer, for its deployment by the Coast Guard? Let's take a look at this diagram, which shows us some of the features of the Chinese destroyer. Tony, if you could take us through what you think, the capabilities that this ship can bring.
I think the main capability that it brings is long range, because this ship has a cruising range of over 8,000 kilometers if they cruise at regular cruise speed versus combat speed. And it did have a very powerful radar for long-range air search. However, based on an artist's painting of the new ship in the Coast Guard library, that radar seems to be removed. And this ship has a tremendous capability to launch multiple missiles, the vertical missile launch system. In the painting that this artist painted, it looks like such launchers are covered. We don't know if it still exists. And the ship also has an anti-submarine capability. If this ship going to the Coast Guard retains that anti-submarine capability, that's an added capability to the PLA Navy, especially in those contested area where U.S. submarines do and other submarines do actually regular sail. And so these are the capability that normal Coast Guard ships wouldn't need.
Let's go back to the virtual launcher system, which I understand is the most lethal component of the destroyer. Firstly, why is that?
The vertical launch system allows you to launch many missiles simultaneously. Like some of the other older ships, they'll have launchers, two launchers, they launch the missile, then they have to reload. A vertical launcher, they can have 40 tubes, then they can, if they want to, they can launch almost all of them within seconds because they all launch from different tubes versus the launch rail.
And does this give it the description of multi-role destroyer?
Absolutely, because the vertical launch system, you can put anti-aircraft missile or anti-ship missile and other systems such as anti-submarine rockets. So it allows a ship to have multi-role and versatile, having those launcher system.
And from the painting that you saw, did you say that you weren't sure whether this has been removed or?
Right, you cannot tell because the artist did not get into that kind of detail. But you can tell from the bridge where you removed the original radar system that's similar to United States Aegis system, the panel radars, and seems to be installing the more traditional type of search radar. So that is one of the unique capability of the 52D because it has those long-range air search radar and you're able to launch the missiles toward those air targets. So,
and briefly about the gun, because I understand that U.S. Coast Guard also has guns. But
right. This gun on 52 Delta is 130 millimeter, and usually Coast Guards, because they don't expect to be faced with warships. So like U.S. Coast Guard has a 57 millimeter gun, and that's more than sufficient to deal with any possible opposition that he comes across, because you're looking at illegal fishing or smuggler. I'm not sure if China plans to retain it. If they retain it, it is a troublesome development. And he also has some closing weapon system that shoots thousands of rounds per minute.
Okay. Now, on October 14th, China began one day of large-scale exercises around Taiwan, which it said served as a warning in response to President Lai Ching-te's speech on Taiwan's National Day. In the Joint Sword 2024B drills taking part was the 2901, known as one of China's two monster Coast Guard ships, for their displacement of over 12,000 tons. This compares with the 052 destroyer's displacement of 7,500 tons a day. After the drills, Beijing again reiterated that it would not renounce the use of force to take Taiwan. So, Professor Liu, what was the significance of using the monster Coast Guard ship in these drills?
Basically, as we know, when all the Coast Guard ships take on the mission in the sea, they will need a certain platform to serve as the hub to support further logistic to all the law enforcement ship in the front line. And whenever the crewmen needs to be exchanged, they can return back to this monster ship, which means that the monster ship will serve as a strong backup standing behind the scene.
And Ronan, do you think that this is a normal practice for other countries to include the Coast Guard in military drills?
I don't think this kind of practice is entirely normal for most of the countries, which by and large, those countries try to keep a very, very fine distinction between the Navy and the Coast Guard forces, right? So that's what, by and large, normal countries do. But obviously, we're dealing with a country that is abnormal.
Yeah. Right, Tony. Taipei said recently about the exercises, the drills, that they were about building China's capacity to turn drills into an all-out or a real attack at any time. So again, I ask you the question, what does that say? What message does that send if the Coast Guard is involved in those drills? It's
very clear in this case. There is Coast Guard has a wartime role, especially if you see how China uses its military militia. Military militia is not directly controlled by PLA Navy. It's controlled by the Coast Guard. And so it's an additional tool that most countries haven't figured out. For sure, Philippines, the United States, and Japan haven't figured out how to deal with this gray zone tool. So I suspect, as Roland said, most countries have a very clear-cut separation between Navy and Coast Guard, and China just blurred that. Therefore,
well, how do they use that to their advantage then? So, for example, we talk about gray zone and Coast Guard involved in that, but if it's actually a second Navy, then, for example, a quarantine around Taiwan?
Precisely. That's where they come into play, because they can literally have these hundreds of military militia ships loiter around an area where they serve like a semi-quarantine. And they are civilian ships. You can't shoot them. You can blow them out of the water if it's not at war. So that's how China is using this effectively, better than any other country in the world. And unfortunately, the free world hasn't figured out a way to overcome these tactics.
Right. According to a 2023 Pentagon report, China has the largest maritime law enforcement fleet in the world, numbering more than 150 vessels over 1,000 tons, including 20 ex-naval corvettes. In addition to being deployed in the East and South China Seas and the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese Coast Guard has also expanded its presence into the broader Pacific. Professor Liu, can I ask you, what's the significance of spreading further afield into the Pacific? China doesn't own territory there, so what would be its main operations there?
As early on, we recognize the main mission of Coast Guard is guarding against their territory and also their right inside exclusive economic zone, 200 nautical miles. So with regard to this, China already deployed quite a number of ships into East China Sea, South China Sea, and also some in the Taiwan Strait. But gradually, they may be extending to beyond the line here. And I personally observe it carry a couple of specific meaning. The first one is combining joint exercise and forces together with Air Force, Navy, as they show in the latest military drill. And the second point, as you mentioned, this is the key word, sovereignty. So people now in Taiwan, especially in the international legal studies, they are reminded China is implementing the so-called Taiwanization, or the internalize this legal issue, considering Taiwan is a part of internal affairs. So with this military drill, one of the very unprecedented things is concurrently, Beijing invited more than 60 countries observers, mainly defense attaché from Beijing, to witness such a military drill surrounding Taiwan, which basically it can cultivate certain international support from their own. This is quite normal for Beijing to conduct these things as they are claiming sovereignty against this renegade province. So I think with this expanding operation of the Coast Guard, it also carry political and legal implication.
Right. And Ronan, when it comes to, we mentioned about the numbers of China's Coast Guard. You know, often when we talk about the difference between the US and the Chinese militaries, we say, navies, we say that the US doesn't have as many vessels, but perhaps the quality of the vessels and also the skills and experience of the personnel operating them are greater. Do you think that numbers, however, is important? You know, when we're talking about the Coast Guard, you know, plus Navy.
Yeah, so I think to sort of echo what you just said, I think quality matters because it directly affects, you know, for example, the power projection capabilities, and quantity also matters greatly for the following 3 reasons. Number 1, quantity can ensure persistence presence, right? So like having a large number of fleets basically can maintain continuous or basically more intensified patrols, right? So that's number 1. Number 2, usually when you have a large number of fleets at your disposal, that oftentimes ensure that you can have rapid response, right? And finally, numbers, sometimes we oftentimes say strength in numbers. Why? Because, you know, it show you the momentum or like the overwhelming force, right? That doesn't necessarily translate into victory, but that certainly will serve as a constraint, maybe for Taiwan and maybe for the US. So in balance, I think quality still matters greatly, but we cannot discount the importance of numbers.
Right. Yeah. Tony, would you agree with that? Just to recap, we've spoken about, you know, the capabilities through vessels like destroyers joining the Coast Guard. We've talked about the size. You know, the monster ships, as Professor said, were over 12,000 tons. And now we're talking about numbers. You know, if we were to add up the Navy, Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese militia, maritime militia, you know, is Ronan right that numbers do matter?
Absolutely. Quantity has its own quality, right? So it does matter. It complicates United States war plan because of the broader coverage and the larger number that you have to consider. So it does put China in a better position. And fortunately, the United States Navy's combat capability is such that they can easily handle it.
Right, okay. And just to return back to the issue of gray zone or war, you know, how can Taiwan, the US and its allies respond to that, given that, you know, we could see the increasing militarization of the Coast Guard? At what point do other nations say, this is a military?
We need to remove the greatness from some of these things. When Coast Guard or maritime militia conduct military-related activities, they should be immediately categorized as combatant and become a legitimate target. I think this obviously requires international agreement on what is a combat operation. But I think when you form up to blockade and conduct the type of things that enables your warfighting capability to increase, then you play in a combat role. If you're a fishing fleet, you'll be fishing and you'll get away from the warship. But if you form up in front of a warship to prevent its path, for example, then that might be considered a combat movement. And so obviously this is a new area that the international community need to tackle. We don't have a definition, but there need to be, because now bad guys are using gray zone, and we need to identify those gray zone and draw the line. This is no longer gray. When you do this, you are a combatant. You are a legitimate target.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. I'm so sorry, we've run out of time. Thank you so much to Tony Hu, Liu Fu-kuo, and Ronan Fu for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe, and see you next time.
经历过人生的话，你发现说，我们大部分都是爱美的。
我自己少遇见一朵花，我可能就不是这个样子。
开始思考什么叫做一个本土性，
大声的唱出来说我是台湾人。
The White House has announced a $50 billion,
$6.6 billion US
for
dollars
semiconductor.
TSMC's come out of the 2022 CHIPS Act.
I want competition with China, not conflict.
Taiwan punches above its weight when it comes to creating chips.
The entire world has great interest in keeping Taiwan's chip industry functional.
So the silicon shield that supposedly has been protecting Taiwan, is there a silicon shield?
We take an exclusive look inside one of the 7 chip design firms picked to make India a semiconductor giant.
How many years the TSMC can still maintain its competitive edge?
People here in Japan are calling it the TSMC shock.
Why is Japan so eager to restore its past glory?
What do you see as the next big shift in the semiconductor industry?
Taiwan's take on global headlines. All that matters, Taiwan Plus.